Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
And welcome back, everybody. Being a caregiver is never an easy situation. You're taking care of somebody you're very much connected to. And it could be a friend, could be a family member, could be a spouse. There's love involved there. And your job is to make them feel more comfortable, help them, support them along the way. There are times where you find out that end of life is coming at some point. It's a game changer. Things radically in your mind change. The caregiving has to invariably change. We're going to look at that, caregiving and end of life. And she's somebody who supports people with this all the time as a coach for just that, caregiving. She's our professional of the year. I didn't even know this existed until I met Marika Humphreys, who's back with us. How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Yeah, had a nice weekend and enjoying the fall colors, which are definitely hitting here and the colder weather. And so, yeah, doing pretty well.
It's so funny you say that because I walked out of my garage yesterday and I said, when did the leaves change? How did I miss that? Usually, I like seeing just the first change and oh, wait, got another one. And also I'm looking and they're on the ground. Like, what did I miss? I don't know.
I do feel like it came fast this year as well. It felt like overnight somebody turned a switch and just turned on fall. But you're starting to see it now here in Western Washington pretty dramatically. But
Yeah.
it did feel fast.
It feels like it exponentially sped up. Like you
Yeah.
might have seen a leaf. Oh, well, okay. End of summer. And then bam, here we go.
Boom.
We're in it.
Yeah. Then we're full in. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you know what? That gets us to what we're talking about today.
It does. Yes, it does.
You know what? It really does. Appreciating the moments, right?
Yes. And transitions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a recent client who I've coached for quite a while. Her husband has cancer and a type of cancer that for many people they can live for many years with this cancer. There's a lot of cancers these days that are you can sort of maintain and have, pretty decent quality of life and live with the cancer. Well, and that was a cancer he had, and it a complication occurred, and now he's basically in the dying process. And so we have changed our coaching and how and what we focus on. And so that's been top of mind for me and something I know I'm sure a lot of listeners out there are going through. And I really think one of the things, it's part of coaching period that I think almost most called to do, and it feels like such a gift to give people because typically when someone we love, and usually this was with disease, obviously, or something that's chronic or has they've been dealing with for a long time, where there is some point at which things change and either medical person tells you or you start to notice or they feel or again a complication occurs and you have the first inkling or are told that this is nearing the end or they are nearing the end or this is the final period. Sometimes we have a time frame around that, whether that's accurate or not. None of us ever know, including the doctors. Sometimes we don't. It can be full of, I think, dread and fear and mixed emotions. Sometimes there's feelings of relief, then there's feelings of guilt, there's feelings of kind of shock and all sorts of things. Like a lot of emotions go on, and it can be a really challenging time period. However, it is also a life transition, and it is a transition for your loved one that you've been caregiving for and for you. And both of those transitions occur and in very different ways. But that process, especially for the life transition, right? Transitioning from living life to not, is a sacred process that I really firmly believe. I didn't quite experience it that way myself. And that caused me, in my own experience, going through my husband's really dying process. I only saw that as a period of time after the fact, after he passed away. But now I've coached many clients through this, and I've reflected a lot on death and the dying process. And there, it is sacred because it's a, a unique time in all of our lives. And when we're a caregiver, we have the opportunity, I think, to treat it differently and with an elevated level of importance if we're able to recognize it and think of it that way. And again, I wanted to talk about this because I don't think that comes to mind. I think it's the very last thing that comes to mind. We mostly approach it with dread and fear and anxiety and questions and overwhelm and all the things. And unfortunately, those are the emotions and those are the feelings and the thoughts and worries that can pull us away from treating this time as sacred and being able to figure out what's most important and then to show up at that time or during this time that way.
There's so many emotions that are happening when you get a diagnosis and now the end is nearer.
Yeah.
Guilt, responsibility. You feel responsible for the way they're going to feel toward the end. There's a lot of things that radically change. But what's the first thing to change your mindset? Because you said before, and I never thought of it this way, in that it's a transition for the caregiver as well. We look at it as for the person you're caring for, but you're both in transition.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first thing to change your mindset is recognizing something has changed here. We are now in the end stages. And that end stage can vary dramatically. I mean, it could be days for some people to months for others. Um, and I actually, I mean, part of this idea of this came about. So if anybody has ever gone through the death of a loved one, hospice, many hospice nurses, there's a pamphlet that they have. I'm pretty sure it's pretty universal pamphlet, and I was given it. And then my late husband died that evening. But the pamphlet is about the dying process, and there are patterns that hospice nurses have been able to see in people who are dying, and many of those signs show up weeks in advance, sometimes even months in advance. And as I was reading this pamphlet, it gave me a lot of comfort, and so, kind of, that was really what has led me as a coach to think about this time. So, recognizing you have to be able to recognize that there's a transition. A lot of times that will come with a doctor, some sort of medical person saying, you know, the body can't survive this, or there's a complication, and then or there's no more, the treatment isn't working any longer. So the change, I mean, recognizing that there's a change, and and you don't even need to know if this is for sure. I don't think it matters. But if you can switch your mind to thinking like this is a transition, or this could be the transition to the end, and therefore, if this is a precious time, what is most important to me? And I want to
Mm.
give some examples of that because I've coached several clients through this. And usually there's the things that I ask them are what's most important. And a lot of times there's something that their partner wants. Like I had one client whose partner, he was, because of where he had a tumor, he lost his ability. He was losing his ability to speak. It was really hard for him to communicate. And she wanted to really preserve kind of his advocate for him when people really struggle to understand him. So they would just kind of look over him and look at her as a translator. And she hated that because he was still there. He just couldn't speak clearly anymore.
Mm.
And so that was something that was really important for her to maintain. And she really just kind of fought to maintain his kind of sense of self and independence in that that communication. Another client, the one I have right now, for her, it's her husband's dignity and the type of experiences that his body is going through with his disease is just pretty awful and unpleasant, and bodily fluids and all the horrible things that happen. And some people that doesn't bother them too much, but for him it does. It's not something he just feels like, I don't want my friends or family to see me like this at all. And so it's really important for her to help him have that wish. So those are a couple examples of like what's most important for your loved one. But
Hmm.
then also, I think for the person, the caregiver, you want to ask yourself that same question. What's most important to me? Is it just having some time with them? Or is it saying some things I never have said or need to say again or want to make sure they know? Or just not getting caught up in the fear and the overwhelm and, bringing the family together? I mean, really asking yourself what is most important, I think, is the next step to recognizing like this is sacred. This is a beautiful and transitionary and limited period of time. It won't last forever. And therefore, what is most important during this time? And answering that question for yourself.
The word sacred really is a game changer.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can say transition, and it is, but when you use
Yeah.
the word sacred, it changes everything. It
Yeah.
really does. What, Marika, what should we do as a caregiver at that point? Now it's clear that things have changed. Diagnosis has come.
Yeah.
Should we talk to the person we're caring with and truly say, what can I do to support you? What kind of language should you use? Sometimes it's uncomfortable.
Yeah. And that it's a great question. Okay, the first thing I encourage people to do is to, I call it intentional survival mode. And because we tend to think of survival mode, I mean, survival mode is like when we're just bare bones kind of living, right? We're just doing what we need to survive. And that is what I think you should consider when it is a kind of end of life period for yourself, in that what can I eliminate right now? What are the extra things in my life? Maybe there are time things, maybe there are chores, maybe they're like, maybe you clean your house, 3 days a week, and now we're just going to do one, or whatever, kind of getting to the bare bones so that you can free up some time and energy and mental space for being focusing on this transition. So that again kind of lends to the word sacred, and just treating it, elevating this time and getting rid of the extra things in life that we don't need. And that I have think we have to choose that mentally, because we get so habitual in our ways and habits. Um, as to having a conversation with your loved one or not, I mean, that so is dependent on your relationship with them.
Mm,
100%, if you are able and you have that relationship and an open, like good communication with the person you're caring for, I absolutely think you absolutely like, what's most important? What's important to you? Asking that question of them is a great question. You may not everybody's going to be able to ask that. And again, it may depend on the relationship. Um, but if you can, I think it's a beautiful question, because that is another thing I think as caregivers. I mean, there's been books written about this, that we tend to assume we know what's important to them, or we focus on safety, or we even focus on wanting them to recover, and they may not want that anymore. Like, I think people in the dying process, they reach a point and some want to fight until the end and others don't. And
mm.
I, that is, our medical system isn't always great at kind of identifying and zeroing in on that question, but that's a very individual question, and it may be hard for someone to hear, but that is also, again, like, I want to just I'm going to get rid of all the treatments so I can be at home and not have tubes hooked up to me and just be able to see families and friends. And that, if you're the caregiver, that may be really hard to hear. It may feel like they're giving up, so really asking the question, what do you want during this time, and being willing to hear the answer, being open.
It's essential. It really, like you said, even though we may not want to hear the answer, it's their life. You're
Yeah.
supporting their life.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. There's a book that I read. I guess it's been a couple of years ago. It's been around for a long time. It's called Being Mortal by I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, but Artul Gawande, something along those lines. But you can look it up. It's called Being Mortal, but it's about end of life decisions in the medical system. He's a doctor, but it goes into also caregiving and how challenging it is for caregivers to let their loved ones decide their own fate, right? And that is one of the things that as a human being, we most prize is our autonomy. Being able to make decisions for ourselves in all situations is something that's like a human, it's something we feel very strongly for. And unfortunately, with aging and disease, a lot of those times people want to take those decisions from us in a well-meaning way, but it's important to have that autonomy, and especially at the end I think it's even more important. So yeah, it can be hard to hear, but that's why that time is sacred, because that was the time, if there's anything you ever wanted to say, or unresolved relationships, grief, losing someone is often about the unresolved aspects of a relationship.
Yeah.
And so again, in the end period is your chance. Doesn't mean you even necessarily need to resolve it with the person, but with yourself, right? You can see a coach for that, and you can see a therapist for that. So just coming to terms with kind of all of those things that transition implies and means is those are what makes it sacred, I guess. And kind of in asking that question, I think, is a first step of your loved one and of yourself.
Thank you
What's
for
important.
the reminder about the challenges of somebody passing or the anticipation thereof, where it's unresolved. There's a
Yeah.
lot of, and that, I guess that gets back to guilt potentially.
Yeah.
That's one of them that's floating out there.
Yeah.
We should have spent more time. I wrestle with myself for having that argument with them back in the day, and that changed our relationship along the way. And here they are now. I'm caring
Yeah.
for them. Um, should you look at it, and I'll preface this. I work with funeral homes on marketing, and for one of them, they're a little more progressive, a little more positive than many. Where our campaign now is celebrate the memories, celebrate the memories. Where
Hmm. Yeah.
it's a celebration of somebody's life as
Yeah.
opposed to saying goodbye.
Yeah.
Should you reframe your mindset when you know that somebody now is going to pass at some point and you're caring for
Hmm.
them for more of a positive look at things? I don't know it's always easy for somebody, but should you reframe the way you look at it?
I, I think not necessarily. And I say that because I, it makes sense for a funeral, for a funeral, um, for for the funeral to kind of focus on celebrating life, and that is a little bit of a change. But I think the period before they're gone, we're not there yet necessarily, and that's the time also when to come to terms with where you are. And if you jump too quick to the memories, if
Well,
there's
all right,
pain to be
I just
overcome.
want to
Yeah.
jump in so I'm clear. A
Yeah.
more positive look at it in any
Yeah.
way that you can. If there's a way, I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know that there is I don't know that there is a right way, but I think to your point, right? We open this by saying usually this is a time of dread and anxiety and fear and anticipation and all of these sort of negative, very challenging things. And those things, when we live in that place of anxiety and fear and dread, we aren't able to be present because we're too busy, being miserable, dreading something that is going to happen. And to, and then you also mentioned like, the regrets, right? We also, when we do lose someone and we look back and we say things like, oh, I wish I had more time, or I wish I would have said this or that. The way to address both of those aspects is by being deliberate and making, and what I mean by that is instead of just going into that time and maybe into the fear and anxiety, at recognizing that it is a sacred time, and then focusing on what's most important. Like, is it important to just be there, or is it important to again, like bring the family together? When we make those choices deliberately and balances too. I have one of my clients, as her husband was dying, I mean, she was working, she needed to work, and at a certain point she had to take a leave of absence. So you still have to make choices. There's a lot of difficult choices to make, but those are the things when you do it with a sense of this is what's most important to me, and make those choices consciously and deliberately, as opposed to from the place of fear or scarcity or anxiety. That's how we have our best bet at not having regrets or looking back, because we're making choices consciously, right? We're choosing deliberately, and sometimes they're hard choices, but also seeing the beauty, I think, in the moments. I mean, the whole point of being able to be present and not caught up in the fear is so that you can see the beauty of that transition. And one of the things I've shared this story before, but because was so huge to me, is when my own husband, we had sent him overseas to a cancer treatment facility in Vienna, Austria, because the treatment they offered there we couldn't quite get in the United States as easily. And that's when he developed a complication, a medical complication. He ended up in a hospital, and I flew over with our 10-year-old at the time because I didn't know if that was going to be the end. And the end ended up not being for about another month later, but so we were able to come home in the meantime. But while I was over there, I ended up sending my 10-year-old home with an aunt. And the time he was in this hospital and he was all hooked up to machines, and he fortunately had, pain medication, but he couldn't walk on his own. He couldn't do anything on his own. But they got him to a somewhat stable point, and we would like spend the days watching cooking shows, and he would send me down to the corner store. It was like a 7-Eleven equivalent in Austria, to get bread and peanut butter and jelly and make like comfort food while we watched these cooking shows. And it was just beautiful time. It was so weirdly normal. The scenario wasn't normal. I mean, in a hospital bed, we're in a foreign country, none of that, but we could just hang out and be together. And that was something I always treasure. And I think I was able to do that because I was also dealing separately with all the stress and anxiety and questions of how am I going to get him home, and all the emotions that are still there, but I had a way to deal with them so I could be present. And when I was with him, I mean, I will treasure that time, and he ended up dying literally it was weeks later. So being able to be present is for the beautiful moments. And sometimes that is reflecting on the memories you've shared.
Sure. Well, I truly, truly, truly appreciate your transparency, because it gives a greater understanding. And I'm thinking this word that you said before, and I was going to bring it up, and then you said it a number of times. beautiful.
Yeah.
So you have a way
Yeah.
of reframing things because those were beautiful moments.
They were.
You'll never forget them. And I'm
Yeah.
sure he won't, because it's my understanding and my belief that when somebody passes, their energy is still around. It's
Yeah.
still, whatever we want to
Yeah.
believe. Um,
Yeah.
but that, I see that moment in that hospital room, you guys making that comfort food. I really do. I get it.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah. And I think we can have those beautiful moments no matter our relationship with the person and no matter the context of their situation. And it's going to look in different forms, but when you have the presence of mind to see it, that's when you're can be there. And that, I think, comes with thinking of it as a sacred time. And and
Yes.
and the last thing, because I know we're at time here, but one of my clients, she's like, "Oh, I'm just crying all the time and I'm so tired of crying." And I said, "You're crying because you love him, and it's love that creates grief, and a lot of times those are counterpoints, right? So
Mm.
embrace the crying because this is sacred, and that means there's love there. And so sometimes it's even reshaping your grief around this process of what's happening."
One thing, one thing that is a stark reminder here is they always say, live in the moment. Live in the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah.
Many of us don't. I didn't. That was my game changer in life. Figured that out. But
Yeah.
in that moment where you were with him, you were
Yeah.
living in this moment. Now, the moment over here is at some point he's going to pass, whether that's the next moment or a moment way past,
Yeah.
all the way over on this side. But for them, you savored that special, beautiful moment. And I think that's part of the lesson here is to live here. Don't worry about here. You know what's
Yeah.
coming over here. Why even think about it? Because you're going to waste this special moment.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And when you're in this period of time, that like that's exactly, if you haven't done it up until this point, now's the time to start, because
Exactly. Yeah.
it's
Easier said than done. I totally get
yeah.
that. But a reminder of why it's
Yeah.
important to look at it that way. Um, how do we find you? You offer so much insight and learned a lot today. How do we
Yeah.
find you?
Yeah. Go to my website, coachmarika.com. That's just coach and Marika is how you spell my name. And that's the best place. You can sign up for a free consultation there. You can check out my podcast on that website and learn, kind of hear my story on there as well. So Coach Marika. That's my,
2 words, sacred and beautiful.
yeah.
That resonates for me. Thank you so much for today. Truly appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house.
And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.